In the early 1980s, Steven Spielberg came up with an idea for a movie called Night Skies, in which a farm community is terrorized by hostile alien invaders. It was meant to be a sequel to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Right before filming began, he had a change of heart and completely rewrote the script to what ultimately became E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a story about a friendly alien who befriends a young boy. Today, I'm going to take you through the process of creating my own version of E.T., based more on the original idea, with a slightly less friendly version of E.T. I hope you enjoy. Oh, and I should caveat that I got this information from a random internet website, but luckily, as we all know, everything you read on the internet is true, so we're good. Let's get into it. I started by making a pretty standard armature, using a relatively heavy gauge wire wrapped in a much thinner wire to give the clay something to bind onto. I designed the armature to leave room in the chest area, where I had plans to add some lighting for E.T.'s iconic glowing heart, which at this point, I wasn't 100% sure the best way to approach that. E.T. has some pretty gangly proportions, so using reference material when creating the armature was key. I used some aluminum foil to bulk up his midsection and save a little clay. I drop in some wiring that I plan to extract later on, thinking I'd be doing at least a few separate bakes on the clay, and I definitely didn't want to fry any lighting during the baking process. In reality, I didn't really have an actual plan to base this off of, so for now, I'll just defer figuring this out until a much more inconvenient time. Once everything is wrapped up and good to go, I start by applying a base layer of clay. I start by slicing up some thin sheets of clay and running them through my pasta maker. When I have a decent batch, I'll start giving the torso a base layer of clay, which at this point is just a foundation to build everything else up on. Typically, I tend to wrap the arms and legs with a base layer of clay as well, but E.T. is a bit unique in that he's just one continuous blob of flesh, so I've decided on a different approach where I build more from the bottom up, bit by bit. I add a few hunks of clay to some key areas to add a little mass and start forming the basic shapes of his body. I smooth those out using a variety of clay tools, and since detail is not what I'm after at this point, I simply use my fingers to get the clay smoothed and shaped into his basic form. Once he resembles a lumpy, misshapen potato, I move on to give him some feet. E.T.'s feet are a little bit of a hybrid between duck feet and, I don't know, maybe platypus feet. Either way, they're definitely weird, with webbed toes that also have a creepily human vibe to them. I get the general shape of them formed and then position them onto the armature wire. I position him back on the base and make sure I'm happy with the foot position and leg length, and then I fill in the gap between his feet and his belly by wrapping a few noodles of clay around the wires and then blending them together using a ball stylus. I repeat this on the other side, and then I go back with my rubber tip tool and my blade tool to define some of the wrinkles and folds. For adding all the detailed folds of skin to the feet, I use tiny noodles of clay for each fold and blend those together before coming back to repeat the process for each flap. One trick I came back to repeatedly during this project was the use of isopropyl alcohol. Typically I'll use it at the end of a sculpt to smooth things out a bit and remove fingerprints, but what I found is that for making copious amounts of wrinkles and skin folds, it's pretty invaluable for taking relatively rough clay and transforming it into something super smooth. The movie version of E.T. has a ton of wrinkles, rolls, and folds, and I want to go even further with that idea to really sell the idea of loose rolls and flab hanging off of him, as you might expect from a portly naked alien. To achieve this, I systematically added dozens of clay noodles, starting at the bottom and working my way up, section by section. As I added noodles, I would blend them into the base model and then add some variation to the size and flow of them to ensure they don't look too consistent. I typically came back to the same tools for this section, which was my rubber tip tool, which is great for getting between the folds to add detail or add variation, and the blade tool, which is great for getting sharper detail and deeper recesses between bigger folds. Once the lower belly was looking good, I realized his backside also needed a little more padding, so I proceeded to graft a few slabs of clay into position and shape them to look a little fuller. Moving on to his ribs, another extremely pronounced component of E.T.'s complex genetic makeup. I start by carving out some guides for where I'm going to position each rib to ensure I'm generally symmetrical. Once I'm happy, I repeat what has become the common theme for this project, which is adding noodles of clay. Each rib gets a noodle, and then the same amount of blending and detailing, and then repeating. I had to be a little careful here because his ribs started out looking a little too much like just more rolls of skin, but I wanted to make sure they stood out as different and had that strained, protruding look, which is one of ET's many trademarks. Moving on to his arms, luckily he doesn't have a lot of muscle mass or definition, so really it's just wrapping some clay around the armature wire and giving them some basic shaping. Once the general shape and volume of his first arm is good, I move it down into its final position and then work on the refined shaping and smoothing. I repeat this on the other side, and then work on getting some of the joints feeling a little more fleshy. Next up is one of ET's freakiest features, his extendable neck. I lay down a foundation of clay, and then what's next? You guessed it, worms, noodles, delios, whatever you want to call them. I use them a lot in this project. Now, at this point, it's worth discussing the fact that I've still yet to do my first bake. Typically, I would have already done at least one bake by now if you had pants or clothes or natural areas to break things up, because it locks things up and makes it much harder to mess things up as you continue working on other areas. But, since this guy has no clothes, there's really no clean point where you can call one area done and move on. Okay, now comes the time to do what I've been dreading. It's at this point where before I can really move on to the hands, I need to sort out the chest light, because once I attach those creepily long fingers, there's going to be no way to get inside his chest without damaging them. So, out comes the knife. I intentionally left the chest area less detailed, knowing I'd have to come back and fish out the wiring. So I'm not too concerned about the time I'll have to spend redoing this area, but I am concerned about messing up other areas in the process, so I try to be as careful as possible during this part. Once I have his chest hollowed out, I open a door to his back and fish the wiring out. I start by tinning the exposed wires, and I'll say right now my soldering iron is on its last leg. Once the wires are tinned, it's simply a matter of connecting them over the iron and watching them melt together. I pre-install some heat shrink tubing, which I heat up and cover up the exposed wires, and then start figuring out how to conceal the excess amount of wiring into the chest cavity. I use translucent Sculpey for the front side of the chest to ensure the chest light can shine through as brightly as possible. And if you've never worked with translucent Sculpey, it has about the same consistency as mozzarella cheese. It's rubbery, crumbly, and doesn't really want to take shape well. The consistency is so different than regular Sculpey that I'm a bit concerned there's going to be a noticeable difference in detail in the chest area. I start by building a basic housing for the light, reminiscent of Tony Stark's arc reactor. I fit that into his chest and position the light inside, and then place the thinnest sheet of clay I can over the chest area without it crumbling apart. I shave away as much volume as I can until things get pretty much level with the regular clay, and then I start blending the edges, bringing some of the regular clay over top of the translucent clay. In the end, I was able to get a pretty decent blend, but the detail will need a little more effort to get matching. A quick test to the light to ensure nothing broke along the way, and we're looking good. Next up, I move on to the hands. I toyed with the idea of adding a light to his finger as well, but the smallest LED with wiring was just really too big to fit in there. Plus, I have other plans for what he's going to be doing with his hands. So, I trim some clay into the general size and start shaping. ET has some really interesting fingers that don't seem overly functional, but regardless, I start with this freakishly long pointer finger before attaching the others. I add a ball of clay for each knuckle and continue with the shaping. I give them a quick pose and then start adding a little bit of wrinkle detail, mostly because the clay is so thin it would be hard to do while attached to the arm. With that done, I attach it to the wrist and promptly erase most of the nice detail I just added to the hand, which I'll need to add carefully back. I get everything blended with the forearm and then move on to his other hand, which was more or less the same process. The difference being this hand will be palm up, and I'm still undecided about what exactly I'm going to put in this hand, so I make sure I have enough palm detail in case it stays exposed. Okay, at this point we're almost ready for the first bake. But before we do that, it's time for a full detail pass. As mentioned before, alcohol was super useful for smoothing out all the skin rolls and folds, but now it's time to go back and add all that skin texture detail. I used the plastic wrap trick for this, which is a great hack for adding lots of fine detail without your sculpting tool dragging or pulling clay along with it. It leaves smooth, soft lines that would be otherwise sharp and run the risk of clay particles being left behind. I use my blade tool for the majority of the deeper wrinkles and crevices, and I go really heavy on ET's arms, which, although they don't have a lot of flabby skin hanging off of them, they do have a lot of striations that fit in with the rest of his body's layers upon layers of skin folds. Then, I go back over the entire body again with my rubber tip tool, adding variation to the deeper grooves and additional superficial scratches to the entire surface. I make sure not to press too hard at this point because I don't want to pull any clay along with the tool. I just lightly drag the tip to add some micro detail. The final detail to add before baking is his gnarly little toenails. I really try to make them as creepy as possible because they do have an oddly finger-like quality to them, so I pre-bake some nails that I press in place with some bacon bond to ensure they stick. I repeat that 5 more times and follow up with a quick detail pass to ensure the toenails are nice and embedded. At this point, I'm finally ready for the first bake. I give him a super light alcohol wash, this time using it in a more traditional manner, which is just to clean up any fingerprints and soften any remaining hard edges. Once he's baked, it's a relief to finally be able to handle him without messing anything up. Overall, I'm extremely happy with how all the details turned out. Onto the head. I start by bulking out the shape using aluminum foil, and then use some CA glue to attach a heavy gauge wire to act as a connecting point to the neck. I wrap the whole thing in some thinner wire for some additional strength, and do a quick test fit to make sure the size feels right. From there, I move on to adding a thin base layer of clay, same as I did for the body. Now, ET has a very unique head, and even under normal circumstances, getting a head right on the first try is not typically something I do. I say this to stress the importance of using reference material from all angles on any type of head you're modeling. I have a habit of working on heads for an extended period without going back to my reference, thinking it looks good, and then I let it sit overnight and come back to it to think it looks horribly disproportioned. In this case, his face originally ended up looking very flat and not at all on model. Regardless, I push forward, working on filling out his eye sockets and eyelids, and continuing to build up some of the general facial features. I correct some of the flatness of his face, curling more of his features around the side of his head for better three-dimensionality, and he finally starts looking a little more like ET. I add a little bit of a scowl to his brows to start incorporating some of that less than friendly vibe to him, and start building up the circles around his eyes, which will need a full detail pass to turn these into fine wrinkles. Time for more slicing and dicing. This time to open up his mouth and give him some teeth, which I think are needed to make him seem a little more angry rather than just mildly annoyed. I hollow out the inside of his mouth, and then I pop in some pre-baked dentures, which took about 3 tries to get the sizing right, and then start building back up his lower jaw. I really just want to see a sliver of teeth, so I keep his mouth almost closed, and then carve away some of the excess clay to slim down his jaw since it's now full of teeth. A few final touches, and I'm ready to position his head onto the body and begin working out the final details. I started with the deeper grooves in his brow using a metal sculpting tool, followed by a softer rubber tip tool. Since these are a little rougher, they get a quick alcohol wipe to smooth things out before moving on. For the finer details, I come back to the plastic wrap method. I use my dental tool for adding fine lines around his nose and cheeks, and my blade tool for pushing into the rings around his eyes to transform them into a series of fine wrinkles and folds. A final pass with the dental tool for micro details, cross-hatching across the deeper grooves to get that realistic skin texture, and then his head gets popped into the oven. I fill the neck cavity with bacon bond, place the head, and then blend the remaining gap between the head and the neck using a thin strip of clay, and once the volume is consistent, a few final needles of clay to match the rest of the neck. Now, the final step before we officially consider the sculpt to be done is to add a texture pass using liquid Sculpey and a rubber glove. ET in particular has some very rough, bumpy skin, so this is a great way to add some texture detail in. I dip my finger in the liquid clay and then give it a few dabs to really just get a very small amount on my fingertip. I dab this over the entire sculpture surface, making sure I only leave behind a very small amount of broken up, inconsistent micro drops of liquid. A super quick bake to lock all that detail in, and we are pens down on the sculpting portion of ET. I'm a really big fan of how unpainted sculptures look. There's something really cool about seeing all that detail in gray clay without paint or textures obscuring anything. It's a little reminiscent of stone or marble sculptures, and I'm always a bit reluctant to apply that first layer of color for fear of ruining it. But we need to take that next step, so I start mixing up a series of browns that I will layer onto ET using my airbrush. I start with a relatively rich brown and apply a heavy coat before coming back and hitting him with a lighter coat of more neutral brown that brings him closer to his final color while still retaining a bit of the richer brown undertones in the crevices. With that, we'll consider his base coat done. I pull the poster tack off his eyes and mouth, which is a great way to mask off areas you don't want to paint without dealing with precise taping. The first step to detailing is to add a variety of darker brown washes to bring out all that fine wrinkle and fold detail. The key to washes is to make sure they stay wet and you wipe off any excess before they dry, otherwise you're going to end up with a much darker base coat than you started with. Once his crevices are nice and dark, I reapply my light brown using a makeup sponge, which will start adding some variation and contouring to his overall form. From there, I go back to my airbrush, using a series of lighter and darker browns to really start pushing more of the contours to his shape, and to get some nice color complexity in his face, ribs, and folds. After giving his whole body a pass of shading and detailing, I do the final touches by adding a slight red to his fingertip, a little color to his nose, and of course we can't forget about his gnarly toenails. His teeth just get a series of brown and yellow washes to keep them nice and dirty, and just the slightest bit of a highlight to the tips. Moving on to the eyes, I use a small ball stylus to dab on some pupils for general placement. ET has some pretty bright blue eyes which I felt were needed to retain that nice color contrast, so I layer in a series of light and dark blues to really make them pop. Lastly, some UV resin to coat the eyes and give them a nice glossy wet look. With that, ET is done, and it's now time to whip up a few props and Easter eggs from the original movie. First up will be his pot of flowers. In the movie, the flowers are a big indicator of ET's physical health, but I thought it'd be hilarious to have him carrying around a pot of dead or dying flowers as more of an indicator of his general disposition. I use a plastic cap to form the shape of the pot and carve a few cracks to make it look a little banged up. Next, I make a variety of flower petals that I'll layer onto each flower that I make. I create a small bud for each flower, and then move on to adding each individual petal until each flower is adequately full, and then they go into the oven. I position the flowers in the flower pot and then move on to making a number of wilted leaves. Everything gets a base coat of paint. I hit the flowers with my airbrush to help get paint in all the crevices, and then use a brush for the green leaves. From there, everything gets heavy washes of blacks and browns to make sure they really don't look like healthy living flowers. Next, the pot gets a coat of terracotta paint, followed by some darker washes and some lighter dry brushing. Next up we have some beer cans, because ET will be hanging in the forest, and who doesn't like pounding back a few beers while chilling in nature? I use a circular cutting tool to create the tops and bottoms of each can. I create some indentations and use a tiny ball stylus to poke some holes in the two tops, and then pull away the extra clay. I create some tiny pull tabs that I place into position before adding some small details. Lastly, I use a flat carving blade to create some rims for the top and bottom of each can, which will facilitate adding some labels to the sides. For the labels, I toyed with the idea of trying to hand paint some beer can labels, but quickly realized that trying to paint tiny lettering would look like total garbage. So I'm trying something I haven't done before, using waterslide decals. I whipped up some period appropriate labels, which I print out in bulk in case I mess any of them up. I slide these onto some aluminum foil, wipe off any excess glue and water, and let them dry. In the meantime, I've connected the top and bottom of each can using thin tracing paper to give me something to glue the labels onto, and then I carefully apply the foil labels and glue up the seam. I give the exposed clay a base coat of silver paint, and then both cans get a full wash pass to dirty them up a little. Last up is obviously the bag of Reese's Pieces that we all know E.T. is a sucker for. I use the water slides for these as well, and after a quick soak to loosen up the glue, I slide it right onto a piece of white plastic bag I had lying around, which will allow me to keep it nice and flexible, as well as retaining some translucency. After gluing the seams together, I fill the bag with a little cotton to give it some volume and make the bag seem full of candy. I create some creases and folds in the bag, and give the edges a tattered edge, since E.T. probably doesn't exercise too much care when ripping this bag open. The last thing we need for this guy is a base. I thought it was appropriate to put him back in the forest where we first see him in the film, so I took some cues from the movie to put him in his natural environment. I start with a couple of foam blocks cut to size and hot glued together. Then I whipped up a mixture of drywall compound with a healthy dose of Mod Podge to add a little more strength and flexibility. I iced the foam block like a cake, applying a thick layer to the top and a thinner layer to the sides. I let that dry overnight, sand the sides smooth, and drill some holes for E.T.'s foot pegs to sit in. I found a few really interesting products for creating realistic ground, the first being an acrylic-based mud, which is basically like a paint with fine sand and grit already mixed into it. On top of that, I also add a little bit of this dirt dust, which is used as movie makeup, but also makes a great top layer to add a little more color variation and earth tones to the mud. I apply this while the acrylic mud is still wet and dab it into place using a coarse paintbrush. A quick spray with some diluted glue to lock everything in, and it's on to painting the sides of the base a flat black before moving on. Next, I start layering various forest elements, starting with some larger flat rocks, which I glue into place around where E.T. will be situated. With everything dried, I apply another patchy coat of watered down glue to prep for adding a layer of grass. I bring out my static grass applicator and mix together the green grass with some yellow, since we don't want things looking overly lush or vibrant, which wouldn't serve the mood I'm after. I attach the ground wire to the wet glue and vigorously shake the applicator until the base is coated with a thick layer of grass, covering up all that nice mud detail I spent so much time on. I vacuum up the excess using a sock trick I learned from Boyle Eye Hobby Time to retain the extra grass, so shout out for that. And the vacuuming also helps some of the flatter grass stand up a little more, which is an added bonus. I let that dry and then create a potpourri of preserved moss, twigs, and leaves that I'll scatter throughout the grass. I work in a number of layers for this part, starting with some of the smaller dirt and debris before moving on to bigger pieces of moss and foliage scattered throughout. I add a few different types of rocks and some larger sticks to represent larger logs. After the first few layers, I saturate the entire surface with isopropyl alcohol, followed by a liberal dose of diluted white glue. The alcohol will help the glue penetrate all the way down through the layers rather than just binding to the surface, which is critical for the amount of debris I'm adding. Lastly, I sprinkle a final layer of tiny fake leaves, spray those down, and then give it a bit of a pat down with a paintbrush handle to make sure things look adequately stepped on and worn in. I had planned to stop there, but it felt like it needed a little more of a backdrop, so I quickly whipped up some fence posts off camera, and once baked, I proceeded to give them brown base coat of paint, followed by a series of dark washes and white dry brushes, trying to make them look super weathered and rotten, like they've been exposed to the elements for a few decades. For some added detail, I add some glue along the surfaces and sprinkle a bit more of my potpourri to make it look like there's some organic material growing along the surface. A little more set dressing for larger plants, and a few final details like some barbed wire between the posts, and a few rusty nails poking out, which also get a wash coat of their own, leaching into the surrounding wood. At this point, the base is done, and all we have left to do is place the man himself in the scene, along with a few of his favorite items. I place the potted plant in E.T.'s hand using a little poster tack to keep it in place. I nestle the wreath bag between his fingers, making sure he has a tight grip. Next comes my favorite part of the diorama, the beer cans. Obviously, just like the rest of us, before discarding empty space travel road rockets in the forest, one must crush them before carelessly chucking them onto the ground. So, this is where the design of these tiny cans really comes into play, and they each get crumpled in on themselves before finding their final resting place. Lastly, E.T. is either setting a trap to kidnap some unsuspecting candy-loving kids, or he's just a really messy eater. But either way, we need a few Reese's Pieces scattered around him to seal the deal. Plus, who would E.T. be without his most profitable marketing ploy to ever grace the silver screen? A few final bits of foliage to seat the cans and E.T.'s toes in the grass, and with that we are done. Let's check it out. A big thanks to all those that stuck around to the very end. I truly appreciate it. If you do want to see more of these videos, be sure to subscribe. Also, I'd love to hear any comments or feedback, or leave me some suggestions for my next project. Thanks all. See you next time.